dealing with topics such as prescription drug abuse, distracted driving, and mental health awareness. Tonight, our focus is gender identity and gender development, and we have two presenters who will be facilitating the conversation. The first is Jennifer Leininger. Ms. Leininger is the Program Director for the Gender and Sex Development Program at Lurie Children's Hospital. Our second presenter is David Fisher, a Senior Policy Analyst for the Health and Medicine Policy Research Group. Tonight's presentation is structured as a limited public forum. The presenters will provide information, and they're hoping to build your awareness about gender identity, gender development, in ways that we can all work together to support young people with gender-related needs. You may have walked in the door with some questions already in your mind, or some questions may form as you are listening to the presentation. We recognize that, and we'll be seeking those questions and try to answer as many of them as we can in the time that we have allotted for this evening's presentation. There were students who were sharing question cards as you entered the auditorium, and at various points during the session, we will take pause to give you a moment to jot down anything that you may want to ask about, and students will come by and collect those cards so we can give them to the presenters. I do want to ask you to remember that those are question cards. They are not comment cards. I don't want anybody to have an expectation that you may write a comment down and expect it to be verbalized here for the group. It is an opportunity for inquiry about something that has been presented that you need further clarification about. So if you could please join me in welcoming our presenters to the stage, we'll go ahead and get started.
Yay!
Hi, good evening.
Hi, so my name is Jen. I prefer she and her pronouns. As Mark said, I manage the gender program at Lurie Children's Hospital. A little bit about me, I have a background, my master's is in education, and I do a lot of outreach and advocacy in schools, education, just sort of like this, to try to help give folks the tools to be inclusive of all students.
I'm David. I use he, his, him pronouns. I direct the Court-Involved Youth Project at Health and Medicine Policy Research Group. My background is actually in youth development, and I did schools advocacy for a long time, and now I do advocacy for the juvenile justice system. And I'm happy to be here today.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's also VIP seats right up front if folks want those. So a little bit about today. There's certainly no right or wrong questions as long as it is a question, as Mark mentioned. And as long as it's asked with respect, it's fair game. Today is the day to get those burning questions answered. And in terms of objectives, what we're hoping to get through today, it's going to be a basic overview of kind of gender diversity. And it'll be sort of within a school context because that is where we are. We'll try to do some more tangible tactics, so I don't want this to be super abstract, I want it to be useful. If there's something specific that you're hoping to get out of today, make sure you include that in the card in the form of a question. And we want to talk about all students and how to support all students, including gender diverse students, but not limited to gender diverse students. So we're going to start with some basic key terms. These are certainly not every term related to gender identity, but it's a good base so that we kind of have a shared framework for language and how to talk about gender diversity. The important thing is to let folks self-identify, so we're not putting people into boxes with these terms, but rather, having some language to discuss people's identities, however it might be for themselves. So the first term we're going to talk about is sex. Sex is assigned at birth. It's typically assigned based on external genitalia. So if someone is born with a penis, we would typically say it's a
male.
Boy, it's a male, exactly. And so those body parts, that sort of sex assigned at birth, is different from what we say is gender identity. So gender identity is a deeply felt sense of self. So raise your hand if you have a gender identity. Yes, everyone does. I love it. Everyone has a gender identity. Important to remember. So everyone has a deeply felt sense of self of being male, female, or a different gender, somewhere in between, or something else entirely. And then gender expression or presentation is what we do that's perceived as more masculine or feminine, right? So clothes, hair, for younger kids, it's things like play preference, it can be mannerisms, all kinds of things. And that's much more societal, right? So it can depend on, as David mentioned last time we did this, it can depend on where you were born, and it can depend on what era you're born in. So you'll notice David is not wearing tights, but maybe 100 years ago he would have been, right? So in terms of gender, what we think of as gender expression and gender conformity, that kind of plays into that part. So do you want to talk a little bit about gender non-conforming? Oh, sexual orientation is next.
So sexual orientation is who you're attracted to in all those ways that we're attracted to people. So who in here has a sexual orientation? Yeah, everyone has a sexual orientation. Everyone has a sense of who they're attracted to. And that's different than gender identity, right? But we tend to conflate the two. So we tend to think about someone who is gender nonconforming as being gay, lesbian, or bisexual, when in fact our attractions are different than our gender identity. And so it's just important to remember that we all have a gender identity and we all have a sexual orientation, and they're different. So when we're talking about gender identity, we talked about transgender, or I should say that Jen mentioned transgender, right? And when we talk about transgender, we tend to talk about folks whose gender identity is different somehow than the sex they were assigned at birth. Whereas cisgender is the same, right? So cis means, for those of you who like Latin roots, cis means to remain static or unchanged, whereas trans means to move across, right? Transient, transportation, to move across gender. Cisgender means to remain static or unchanged. Your gender identity is the same as the sex you were assigned at birth.
And then gender expansive, or sometimes called gender non-conforming. So that's when someone's gender expression, what we do that's perceived as masculine or feminine, right? When that's different from what societal kind of expectations are based on our sex assigned at birth. So it can kind of mean a couple of things, so bear with me. The first thing it can kind of mean is, for example, someone whose sex assigned at birth is male, who identifies as male, but likes to express his femininity. So maybe wears more feminine clothing, maybe has more feminine mannerisms, things like that, that's perceived as sort of not conforming to expectations based on his sex assigned at birth. But it can also mean someone whose gender identity, someone whose gender sex assigned at birth is male, identifies as female and likes to express her femininity. Does that make sense? So it can kind of be a few things. It's a little bit of an umbrella term, which can be confusing, and I totally understand. It is something that lasts for more than 6 months, so it's not just someone who's pushing gender boundaries, because what we know about gender development is that it's really, really, really typical for, especially if there's anyone who's worked in early childhood here, which is sort of what my original background was in. Early childhood, there's tons of gender play and gender playing with gender roles and cross-gender play. So that's a little bit different from gender non-conforming, which is a longer lasting scenario. So David mentioned trans, another umbrella term, right? So there's a lot of gender identities that fall underneath sort of the transgender umbrella, but basically it's, as David mentioned, someone whose gender identity is different from their sex assigned at birth. The important thing to remember about transgender identity, well, there's a number of important things, but one is that it's tied to identity, how someone feels, not how someone looks or their body parts, right? It's also important to know that gender identity, including transgender identity, is not pathological. So we can't diagnose it. There's nothing that we could do to diagnose someone as transgender or not. So how do you know someone is trans? They tell you, right? And in terms of how to use the word, because this might be a new word for some people, transgender is an adjective, not a noun or a verb. We're in a school. I think it's important to know grammar too. So you would not say someone is a transgender, right? That's really limiting. They don't become transgendered, and so you would say someone is a trans student, a trans male, a trans female, but again, allowing people the space to identify whatever way that they would like. So someone whose sex assigned at birth is male, but identifies as female, may call herself a trans female. She may also just call herself female, right? Again, just letting people self-identify, because really language is about making sure people feel empowered with their own identity.
So another umbrella term for everyone is non-binary, which is an umbrella term which reflects gender identities that that don't fit into our accepted categories of male or female. So when we think of transgender people, we think of folks like Laverne Cox, who was on the previous slide, right? So she's a woman who was born assigned male at birth but identifies as female, right? And so folks tend to think of people who still fall into that binary world, right? Of a person who is maybe born assigned male but identifies as female, or born assigned female but identifies as male. But there are a whole variety and diversity of genders that doesn't fit into our binary. And so that would fall underneath the category or the umbrella of non-binary.
Yeah, so in the list of few terms that might be underneath the non-binary umbrella. So for folks who haven't heard these before, it's genderqueer, gender fluid, agender, non-gender. I mean, there's a ton of different ones. And just so folks know, a lot of these individuals may prefer a pronoun that's not he or she. The pronoun that most non-binary folks that I've worked with prefer is they or them. Have folks heard that before for pronouns? Some, maybe, yes. I notice a lot of the students have, which is unsurprising. Yeah, so just so that people know, because I think sometimes it sounds a little unfamiliar. It sounds maybe a little grammatically awkward if you're not used to it. So one, I would say, takes practice. That's okay. Just like a new, key word that you're learning for the day. Using they, them, theirs as a single-use pronoun can take practice. But the American Dialect Society named it their Word of the Year last year. And the Washington Post came up with some guidelines to help their staff writers use they, them, theirs as a single-use pronoun in a grammatically correct way. So I've talked to a lot of English teachers about this, as I'm sure you can imagine it comes up. And it's just important to know that language is evolving, and actually, as a side note, Shakespeare and Jane Austen used they, them, theirs as single-use pronouns. So, if they did it, we can too. Do you want to talk about intersex identity?
Sure. Jen mentioned sex assigned at birth. We all receive sex assigned at birth. Most folks, the doctor says it's a boy or it's a girl, and that's based on one characteristic of biological sex, of which there are multiple, and that's external genitalia. For intersex folks are folks whose sex assigned at birth differs somehow from the expected patterns or norms of male or female. So like gender identity, sex also exists on a spectrum. So folks do not fall always into this binary of male or female, but there's a diversity of sex assigned at birth as well. That said, generally folks receive a binary sex assignment because we don't have a world that sort of thinks about the ways that intersex conditions come up. And this was previously called hermaphrodite, and that's no longer an accepted or appropriate term, and would be considered fairly offensive.
So now you know, right? A lot of these things you don't know until you know, right? So I mean, it's totally fair if these are mistakes you've made in the past, but now you know and you can't pretend you don't. So this is just an example of what the trans umbrella kind of looks like. I think we've talked about it quite a bit. But just thinking through, like, to visualize the trans umbrella as a larger term, lots of different terms sort of fall underneath the trans umbrella. We want to make sure to give space to people to have different terms and language to identify the way that feels best for them. The important takeaway from this is that there's no one way to be trans. So if you worked with one trans person, amazing. I hope you were supportive and an advocate for them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what their needs will be the same as the next person they'll meet. Just like, no two people are the same, no two trans people are the same. I hope most people know what pronouns are. You'd be surprised how many high schoolers I talk to that do not, which is a whole issue altogether. But pronouns are really important. And it's important to ask what people's preferred pronouns are. So he, she, they, them, or a different pronoun. And making sure to use those pronouns respectfully and consistently, even if they're different from someone's, what you think might be the pronoun that they use based on their sex assignment. You can't always tell what pronoun someone's going to use based on how they look either. So that's why it's helpful to ask. And if you're uncomfortable asking, maybe just using the name if it's a short interaction with someone. They, them is also neutral, so you can use that as a pronoun. If you're also not sure how to ask, you can start with yourself. So I always start by introducing myself, Jen, she and her. That way it's not just putting someone else on the spot, right? So making sure we're asking everyone Also making sure we're not just asking someone who we're maybe not sure what their pronoun is. So it's not like, Sally, you look more feminine, so she, you, I'm not sure, don't do that, right? That's not supportive.
And also with gender pronouns, people make mistakes, and I think sometimes we don't talk about trans issues because we're afraid that we're going to make a mistake. And so if you do mess up with someone's pronouns, just own it. Recognize that you made the mistake, apologize, and make the commitment to try to do better moving forward. It's when it becomes sort of a pattern of not using the correct pronouns that it becomes really disrespectful. But if you make a mistake, own it.
Yeah. And so an example of what that might look like, I've seen this handled in sort of two different ways. So let's say you know that someone that you knew as Mike actually prefers the name Michelle, and she and her pronouns. Let's say you accidentally call her Mike. There's sort of two ways I've seen it handled. One is, I'm sorry, I know I should be calling you Mike, but you used to look like Mike too. Do you think Mike feel better? Number two, right? But most of the time I hear people use the first option, and I think it's because we want to explain. We want to explain why we made the mistake, but you know what? It doesn't matter, because it was your mistake. It's not someone's job to look a certain way to make it easier for you, and we don't ask cisgender people, so folks who sex assign at birth aligns with their gender identity, we don't ask them to look a certain way, right? So we can't ask trans folks to look a certain way either. I think that's important. Do you want to talk about the sort of spectrum of it?
Sure. So we've talked about a lot of things, right? So we've talked about sex assigned at birth, and we've talked about gender identity, and we've talked about gender expression. And all of these things exist on a spectrum, and we can all fall in different places on our spectrum. So as we start to think about people's gender identities, we tend to think, again, a person who was born assigned male identifies as a man and presents themselves in a masculine way. And that is the way that we have schemas developed in our world to explain things. But folks can fall all over. And with gender expression, as we mentioned before, it's very much rooted in time and culture and place. It's also rooted in context, right? Sometimes folks are, a person who identifies as a woman is wearing makeup and her hair is done and she's wearing a dress and she is what we might consider the height of femininity, right? And other times she might be kicking it in her sweats, right? And we might not consider that the height of femininity, but that doesn't take away from who she is as a woman. Additionally, when we think about gender expression, we also think about gender roles. And we think about gender roles as being, so if I'm talking about gender roles for men, what are some words that describe men, right? So if we think about like strong is one, other ideas?
Maybe rough and tumble.
Yeah, rough and tumble.
Not emotional.
Unemotional, stoic. Yeah, angry, if they have an emotion, it's angry. What are other things?
We won't hold it against you. I feel like sometimes folks think that if we say it out loud, then people will think that that's how you feel.
Yeah.
And what we know is that most, people don't fall into those gender stereotypes, right?
So you've got this category of strong, aggressive, angry, stoic, unemotional. And then for women, we've got things like nurturing, right? Emotional. We've got, what else? We have meek.
Empathetic.
Pathetic.
I mean, it's interesting because I usually ask this in high schools. And so you'll hear specific things about high school boys. They like sports, they are rough and tumble, they can be rude. Girls are emotional, gossipy, like pink, like fairies, whatever it may be. So, yeah.
So we've got these gender roles, right, that we're told, and yet, how many men in here are fathers? How many men in here feel like to be a good father you need to be nurturing? Right? So when we're talking about gender roles, we would say that nurturing is a feminine trait, but in fact we want everyone to be nurturing. We want everyone to have some of these traits, and when we concentrate on these very, very narrow gender boxes and what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman, we're taking away a lot of what it means to be a full, well-rounded person and human.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about gender stereotypes too, and how they do impact everyone. But in terms of gender development, it starts at a pretty young age, actually. I actually do a lot of work with even elementary schools, early childhood, because what we're seeing is that gender starts at 18 months, really. I mean, that's when folks start to develop the ability to label gender, and at about 2 years old is when they start to see some differences in gender. By 5 to 6 years old, most children declare a gender identity, and for most people, it's consistent with their sex assigned at birth. I will say this doesn't mean that every trans person is going to come out by 5 or 6 years old, right? Because what we know is that a lot of this is a process for individuals, particularly because our society is so binary, that sometimes folks will maybe feel like something was a little bit different, a little not quite right, but they didn't exactly know how to label it, right? So we'll see folks come out much, much later, even in high school, but even in retirement. I mean, so there's a huge range of when people come out, but this is sort of a general gender development, and the citation for that Handbook of Child Psychology is below. I do think, to David's point, it feeds right into this discussion about cultural norms. Have folks seen this quote before from the Ladies' Home Journal? I think it's hilarious, especially as someone who is in the world of baby things. They're super gendered, and so, you know, everything is like gender reveal parties, pink is for girls, blue is for boys. But 100 years ago, it's pretty clear that if you showed up to a baby shower and it was super pink, they might have been like, oh, you're having a boy, congratulations, right? So there's no such thing as a girl color or a boy color, right? Really helpful to remember. So let's let hair be hair and shoes be shoes and just clothes be clothes. This is a picture of FDR as a kid at about age 3. And in this photo, when I ask people to share what his gender expression typically looks like, they'll say, oh, it's a little girl, she looks really feminine. Because at this time, currently, right, the way that he looks is really feminine, right? But 100 years ago, it wasn't considered super feminine, right? This is what little boys wore. They wore little dresses, apparently a very fancy hat. But this was conforming for the time. But now it's considered really feminine, right? So I'm certainly not trying to assert that FDR was transgender. I'm just saying the way that we perceive gender and the way that we perceive gender expression evolves over time, right? So what's considered masculine and feminine also evolves over time. So we already sort of talked about these gender stereotypes, right? There's no one way to be a boy or a girl or any other gender. And what we know is that these gender stereotypes negatively impact our kids. Because I don't know anyone, and no one has ever asserted that they know anyone, who fits completely into this pink box over here, or this blue box over here, right? Because people are complex. That's what makes people so amazing. And so because we are so frequently segregating people by gender and reinforcing gender stereotypes in ways that we don't mean to, it's negatively impacting our kids. There was a study that came out in early January that showed that girls who, in 3rd grade, starting in 3rd grade, this starts, that girls who wrote female on the top of their math test, guess what happened? They did worse. Anyone have any ideas why? Are girls in this box good at math, or is that a boy box? It's in the boy box. So it was reinforcing that girls are supposed to not be good at math when they're writing female at the top. Well, we don't want that to happen to any of our kids, right? So what we know is these gender stereotypes and these rigid ideas that we have of gender certainly impact our transgender kids. But they impact everyone, and they negatively impact everyone. So there's a few ways we sort of want to try to combat these gender stereotypes. One is just to look for opportunities how gender is conveyed. So that's in books, that is in newspaper articles. Jaden Smith is he's Will Smith's kid, in case you're not paying attention on E! Online. But he is the new women's wear model for Louis Vuitton, and he's a cisgender guy. But that's a really good conversation to have, right? Well, what does that mean? Why is this person wearing girl clothes, right? Well, is there such a thing as girl clothes? Maybe he just loves this fabulous dress and how it spins. Because I know I do. That's my favorite part about dresses. So thinking about ways to explore how gender is conveyed, interpersonal interactions too. So interrupting gender stereotypes. Has anyone ever heard someone say, oh, man up? Mm-hmm. Or you run like a girl? Or that's a girl haircut? Or that's a boy haircut? Those are all really good opportunities to say, what do you mean by man up? Just asking a student that question or a child that question gives them an opportunity to reflect. What do I mean? You run like a girl. Oh, you mean those like Olympian female athletes? Is that that's what you're referring to? Right? Probably that's not what they meant, but a good opportunity to explore what their intentionality behind that is. So we do want to start to talk a little more specifically about trans and gender nonconforming students. I think this quote by poet Adrienne Rich is amazing, especially when we're talking about the context and the power that folks have at schools. So I'm not going to do an interpretive reading, but I will give you a second to read it. And maybe if folks do have questions, this is a good chance in the next few minutes for our wonderful student card collectors to grab some of the no cards. So if you have some, just hold it up. And over the next few minutes, we'll try to collect those and get some of those questions answered.
So if you want to take a minute to jot them down or just, raise them up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So when we're talking about working with students in school, I often ask teachers and parents in these scenarios, what is everyone looking for in school? So David, what would you maybe say? What is everyone sort of looking for when they said they're going to school?
I mean, my argument is that we send our kids to schools, and particularly public schools, because we want our kids to receive a rich education where they are socialized well, they learn how to interact with others, they learn how to be respectful to adults and other people in their lives. We're sending our kids to schools to be whole people and to be successful in life. And I think that we also all, people are here and people send their kids to schools wanting to know that they're going to be safe and respected. And I think that that's a universal truth for all of us.
Absolutely. Yeah, the other thing that I love when I ask that question of parent nights, I love when people say that they have to. So I guess unless you all want to homeschool, which I support as well, but you have to send your kids somewhere, right? So that's also another reason folks send their kids to school. And in order to learn effectively in school, there's a thing called the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Is this new for anybody? So they teach it a lot in educators. All educators are very familiar with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what you'll see, sort of at the bottom, the most important part, in order to learn, which is the very top, student is able to learn. In order to do that, you need to have your physiological needs met. So eating, a place to live, safety is the next chunk. So making sure that you're safe, making sure you're part of the school community, so forming relationships, having self-esteem, all of those are really important building blocks, and without those, they found that all children cannot learn effectively. The important thing I want to point out here, you don't see this saying like the transgender Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is every student. This is what every single person needs in order to learn effectively in school. Obviously, we think schools play an important role, right? So schools can help socialize, learning, acceptance, broad horizons, character building. The list kind of goes on and on. And we do know that gender impacts everyone, right? So there was a study done out of UIC that found that 50%, this is cyberbullying, but 50% of bullying in the study was based on gender, sexual orientation or gender perception. So not being as masculine as other students and not being as feminine as other students. And more than 50% of the kids felt unsafe in school because of this type of bullying. And this is not just trans kids. This is all kids, right?
And another study that was done looking at how middle and high schoolers think about misogynistic and homophobic bullying. When boys were surveyed, and then when there were focus groups done with boys, cross-sampling of boys who are in these various middle and high schools, the worst words that you could call boys were related to being feminine or related to being gay. So we know that when we're talking about sexual orientation and gender identity, first of all, we all have sexual orientation and gender identity, but also that these are identities that are being used as weapons against all students.
Yeah, absolutely. So of course this impacts our transgender students, but again, it really, part of these conversations, this impacts everyone. There are specific health outcomes tied to rejection and acceptance of transgender students. So in category 1, these are students who were not supported. This is based on parental support. So it's a good group to talk about parental support with. What they found from a number of studies, which I've cited below, indicate that transgender students who are not supported by their families are at really increased risk for violence, harassment, suicidality, poor mental health outcomes, high dropout rates. I mean, the list goes sort of tragically on. And those who are supported have better self-esteem, higher graduation rates, better peer relationships, better overall mental health outcomes. And this is based on a number of different studies that have been done. So part of the reason that we talk about this within a school context, where do most kids spend their time outside of home? School, right? School. So folks who are in category 1 who are not supported by parents, who are at sort of these really increased risks for negative health outcomes, school may be the first place that they're supported. School may be the first place that they can start to combat some of those negative outcomes. And folks who are in category 2 who are supported, school may be the first place outside the home where they can feel like they're their authentic selves. I work with so many amazing young people who are transgender, who identify as themselves at home, use a name and pronoun that feels good at home, but the second they step out that door, they go back to being, going by their legal name and going by their pronoun that aligns with their sex assigned at birth because of fear of lack of acceptance. And that has really weighed on a lot of the young people that I've worked with. So I just wanted to show this. I'm not going to read all these statistics to you, but I do think within the context of that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this is really important because this is based on a study done out of Toronto with over 400 young people. But look at how many faced housing problems without parental support, right? So when we're thinking about those like physiological needs, you're not going to learn if you don't have housing. You're not going to learn if you don't have that sense of belonging. You're not going to learn if you're facing significant depressive symptoms, right? So I think that just through that context, through that lens, is sort of a helpful tool. Do you want to talk through the importance of sort of, these are just some statistics, so actually maybe we should have these up. Folks can read them while we take a peek at some of the questions.
Sure.
That makes sense? There's one too. Yeah, great. Do you want to address that question now?
Sure.
Sure.
Okay, so one of our questions is how will private schools address trans issues or deal with trans issues? And that's a great question, and I would say that it is, first of all, it's not how will they, it's how are they. We have a lot of private schools that are addressing trans issues. And it depends really on the school. So legally, there are different requirements for schools that are private and religious and don't accept public funds. And so those schools may deal with these issues in a whole variety of different ways. For all other private schools, so like therapeutic day schools that receive a significant number of students with disabilities, or students who have higher needs, these therapeutic schools are actually dealing with this at a very high rate, because LGBTQ youth are often being pushed out of public schools and pushed into schools like therapeutic schools. And so they're dealing with it very much like other districts are dealing with it, right? By trying to figure out how to support students in their care, by trying to figure out how to train their teachers, by trying to figure out what makes sense for their student body. And I think that what we're seeing is that there are a whole variety of private schools that are addressing these issues in very similar ways to District 211, which is trying really hard to make sure that students in their care are supported and respected.
Yeah, and to tag on that, I mean, that includes some religious schools too.
Yeah,
I mean, I've worked with Catholic schools, including Catholic elementary schools, that are really trying to make sure that all of their students are included, including their transgender students. So this is not just a public schools issue, this is a schools issue, right? Something that all schools need to figure out how to make sure every student is supported and included. The other question was, what is pansexual? I am so glad someone asked that question. Because one, I first heard the word pansexual from a young person, from a teenager, and I tried to play cool, like I knew what it was, and I definitely did not. So I'm glad someone asked. So pansexual is a sexual orientation, meaning who you're attracted to. So pansexual is not a gender identity, right? So pansexual is similar in some ways. Are people familiar with the term bisexual? Most people, so bisexual typically means attracted to men or women, men and women, excuse me. Whereas pansexual is a little bit more inclusive. It's the ability to be attracted to all genders, right? So it's not necessarily thinking about gender in a binary way in terms of who someone might be attracted to, right? So not discriminating essentially on who they might be attracted to based on any type of gender. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, you can do another note card, and I will try to explain it a little bit more in detail as well. I hope you get a chance to take a look at some of these statistics without me just rattling them off to you, but I think it really helps drive home the significance of why we're doing this. It's
Sorry
not
for
okay
my
that
writing.
almost 90% of trans kids don't feel safe in school, or that 1 in 6 drops out, or that half is regularly skipping school because of safety issues. So these specific statistics are really why we're here in a lot of ways, why we have to have these conversations. So a transition, I hear that a lot at school. People aren't quite sure what it means. Let's talk about it. So there's a few ways to transition. You can transition socially, medically, or legally. What we're worried about in schools is the social transition. I guess I shouldn't say worried. What we're navigating in schools is a social transition, typically. So a social transition is essentially living as your affirmed gender identity. So that might be changing your gender expression to a little more closely match your gender identity. It often means changing your pronoun to more closely align with your gender identity. It may mean changing your name to align with your gender identity. It often means participating in activities that align with your gender identity. So if someone is a trans girl, she may join Girl Scouts. She may play on the volleyball team. She may go by Michelle instead of Mike. She may go by she and her, right? You don't have to medically or legally transition in order to have a supported social transition in school. A medical transition is just what it sounds like. It's taking medications or having any number of different surgeries to make your body more closely match your gender identity. Not everyone can afford to medically transition. There's some barriers there, and not everyone wants to. I think that's important to know also. Not everyone feels uncomfortable in their body who's a transgender person. And then a legal transition is changing your documents to more closely match your gender identity. So passport, birth certificate, social security card, state ID. I mean, it can be pretty overwhelming, as I'm sure you can imagine. And there's different barriers for each of these things. So there are barriers for social transitioning, right? If you don't have the money to buy new clothes, if you don't have supportive families, that can be a barrier. If you don't have supportive families, the medical transition is really impossible until you're 18. If you don't have the means, it can be a barrier as well. Same thing with legal transition. So you can think about transitioning as sort of like a buffet of options. There's no one way to transition, and everyone is different, right? So everyone's going to pick and choose what they can afford and what makes the most sense for them, right? So everyone's different. Anything else to add about this? So Lurie Children's has a gender-affirming approach to working with transgender people. And so by affirming, it basically means acknowledging the gender identity of someone. And there are a few sort of shared tenets of an affirming approach. One is recognizing the gender is not binary, right? So we've talked about that quite a bit, that there's not just sort of male and female gender identities. And the gender may be fluid, right, in terms of that. The other tenet is that genders are not disorders, right? So I mentioned earlier that gender is not pathological, so transgender is not a diagnosis. So that's important to know. And then there's appropriate guidelines and best practices and recommendations. So that goes for the work we do in schools, that goes for the work we do medically, mental health. I mean, so we're following the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And I know David is going to talk about a lot of the medical and mental health institutions that are giving some guidelines and policies around working with trans people as well. Because historically, Lurie Children's and other institutions like ours have been barriers, right? Because we weren't equipped to support transgender people in the way that they needed.
All right, so we are going to talk about some of the major professional organizations that support this gender-affirming approach and support transgender and gender nonconforming people. The American Academy of Pediatrics is the largest professional association for pediatricians and the practice of pediatrics here in America. It is the sort of gold standard by which policies and practices are applied. So the American Academy of Pediatrics is sort of the accepted organization around issues of pediatrics. So they have, I think that's what's next, right? Oh, so yeah, they have a couple of statements about supporting transgender and gender nonconforming children. They have no way to really predict how a child is going to end up identifying themselves in life. What is most important, above anything else, is to create a place in their home where a child feels safe and affirmed unconditionally. So it's really critically important that children are accepted, that they are supported, and we know that there are children who may be gender nonconforming in childhood and who grow up to not identify as transgender. Those children are not worse for the wear by having a parent who supports and loves them. In fact, they do better off by having a parent who supported and loved who they were as they were coming up. Similarly, transgender children who identify with a gender that is different than the sex they were assigned at birth throughout childhood and into adolescence, and who continue to identify as transgender, also, as we saw, see really, beneficial mental health outcomes.
So it's a really good resource. It's called Healthy Families from the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's available online. We wanted to share with you mostly as just a resource and a tool. So the folks knew that it was available because, as David mentioned, I mean, the AAP is sort of the Lurie Children's and any other sort of reputable medical institution. They're looking to the AAP. That is sort of the voice of reason within the medical community. So it talks about, how to necessarily navigate early childhood, middle childhood, and high school, and how, gender maybe is developed. It does say, that there's no evidence that parenting is responsible for a child having a gender identity that's not congruent with their sex assigned at birth. Important to know, because I think, as with many, variations in diversity, parents look to themselves as the cause quite often. And what we know is that the important thing is to create a space where bullying is prevented and love is created.
So here are some recommendations around working with LGBTQ children and families. And it is that pediatricians should be available to answer questions and be able to talk about LGBTQ as a normal part of human diversity rather than, it is a part of our human diversity, right? Talking about how transgender adolescents need to be affirmed. And physicians need to be, involved in this treatment and referral process. Pediatricians should be thinking about how to support parents who are working through these issues. Pediatricians need to support things like gay-straight alliances and should educate themselves to know about the resources that are available for the children and families in their care, including LGBTQ children and families. So additional statements, and this actually applies really particularly to a question that we received around would this time be better spent if we were sort of talking to and learning about how to counsel students about not being transgender, about reconsidering their transgender identity. And so I think that it's important that we recognize that all major mental health and medical associations really state that not supporting a child's gender identity, regardless of whether or not it corresponds with their sex assigned at birth, is what is going to create healthy children. And in fact, if you have clinical licensure in this state, so if you're a licensed mental health provider, it's actually illegal to provide what's called reparative therapy to anyone, or conversion therapy, to anyone under the age of 18. So it's actually shown to have such negative mental health outcomes for people that it is now against the law in Illinois to provide that if you are a licensed mental health professional.
So there's actually a piece, I went back a little bit because the AAP actually addresses this. It says, research suggests that gender is something we are born with, and it can't be changed by interventions. So I think that's important for folks to understand. That's sometimes new information for some individuals. And Lurie Children's, the conversion therapy ban, which was signed into law by Rauner last year, was something that Lurie Children's was really supportive of because we know, and all medical research suggests, and mental health research suggests, that conversion therapy is very harmful to children and adolescents. So these are some additional associations that have policy statements essentially advocating for an affirming approach. It's important, I think, to note that there's a number of school-based professional organizations, including school nurses, college physicians, school counseling association, a number of associations. So that's sort of where we're pulling a lot of this from. So similar to, I mentioned the affirming approach with Lurie Children's, those 3 tenets. The last tenet is that we are looking to best practices and guidelines to create our approach. This is part of that. Really all leading professional organizations are advocates for an affirming approach. And that's why, so I'm really excited to report, actually, so this year, Lurie Children's approved a policy statement in support of transgender young people, because what we were seeing is that in this discourse, we hadn't sort of made a public statement. And actually a lot of children's hospitals haven't up until this point. And so in March, we released a statement in support of transgender young people, which we do for a number of other things like vaccinations, HIV, violence prevention. I mean, there's a lot, World Health. So this is not new for Lurie Children's, but it was board approved unanimously. So that was really exciting because, again, looking to a lot of this research and a lot of these other organizations, we were on board and understood that this is part of what transgender students need in order to be supportive. The other thing I do want to say is that Lurie Children's is not a partisan institution. So this is actually, we would never release a statement that would help some kids but hurt others. We would never ever do that. So Lurie Children's advocates for the inclusion and support of trans young people because what we know is it benefits and includes everyone, right? It doesn't take away rights from any other students. So I think that that's important to note as well. So there's a brief video that we'd like to share with you because we are talking a lot about transgender young people, but as you can see,
I think that I first realized it when the end of elementary school and the beginning of middle school started. That's when everyone was kind of sort of making that transition from child to a teenager. It was really scary. I remember all the time just like sitting in my room before I went to bed and just praying that I would wake up a boy, and it would happen all the time, and I was just so afraid that I just felt trapped in a situation where I didn't know that there was anything that I could do to change it. I came up to my mom saying that I was questioning my identity, and she was just, the whole process of her, before she came to where she is now, which is super accepting, she was just very confused. And which a lot of people are, like there's nothing, I felt like I couldn't blame her for her being confused just because she hasn't been exposed to it. Before she was completely engulfed in the LGBTQ community like she is now, her main concern was, like, what did I do wrong? And it took her a while to realize there's absolutely nothing that I did wrong. When I first came out, people would be confused about, even people who were trying to be accepting, they would be confused about what the difference, if they should say transsexual, or if they should say transgender, or if they should, what pronouns they should use with me. As students go, I feel like they've come farther now, seeing me just kind of not listen to what anyone else says and just do my own thing. I don't feel like, even though my gender identity is such an important part of my life that I've taken it to be, it's not something that defines me. And people in my school have referred to me as the trans kid, and as I am a trans person and I am a child, like that doesn't make me the one trans kid in the whole world. There's so many other trans people, and that shouldn't define anyone. I've been on testosterone, which is the male hormone, for about a little over 8 months now, which is injections. So that's weekly, and I've noticed a lot of changes, obviously, in my voice, and I don't know if you can see the little facial hair there. It's going well. So I've been on that, and I just recently had top surgery, which is chest surgery to construct it to look more as like a cisgender male would look. And so I had that about 3 months ago, and I couldn't be more happy with everything that's going on. I've never felt more like comfortable in one with my body, so it's really amazing.
Great, so if folks do have more questions, just make sure you hold them up. So write it down on a note card, and hold it up for our young people. And if folks need more note cards, they can provide those as well.
Tons of note cards.
Tons of note cards. We have all of the note cards. Yes, thank you so much. We'll have to do an actual formal round of applause for our fun helpers. So I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be an ally. Being an ally doesn't necessarily mean, marching or, writing policy or doing huge things. It can just mean some really important small things you can do interpersonally. So one way to be an ally, and probably I would say the best way to be an ally, is just ask what someone needs. So if a student tells you that they're transgender, if a young person tells you that they're transgender, if a parent shares with you that they have a child that's transgender, ask, what can I do for you? How can I support you? What do you need? You might be the first person to ever ask that question, and it can be hugely powerful and really helpful, really, really meaningful. Taking their gender identity and gender expression seriously. We already talked about the importance of acknowledging and owning mistakes, because we are human beings, and you may make them, you will make them. And I don't want folks to feel like working with trans people is scary, and you have to walk on eggshells all the time. So just recognizing the ways to sort of navigate those mistakes is really, I think, empowering. Respecting someone's name and pronouns. So has anyone ever heard the term misgendering? So misgendering someone is basically using a name and pronoun that's different from what aligns with their gender identity. It's a form of bullying and can be really harmful. So we advocate for folks to use a preferred name and pronoun even when the student's not there. So I've seen some amazing parents and educators who, the second a kid leaves the room, they're like, okay, I know that Michelle uses Michelle when she's here, but we're going to call her Mike now. Which, one, is setting you up for more failure, for more mistakes, like number 3. But also, it's sort of demonstrating a lack of respect to the other people in the room. It's saying that you don't take that person's gender identity and gender expression seriously, like number 2 asks you to do. These are misnumbered. Do not out someone or allow someone else to do so without their consent. So that's a really important piece. I think David can share a more important anecdotal story about the importance of this piece. So I'll finish this list and then maybe have David share the importance of number 5. This presentation, David's is also at the end. If someone needs resources and you don't have any, that's okay. I do, and I can give them to you. And it's a really good way to navigate maybe if there's discomfort on your end. Maybe you're not quite there with navigating gender identity. Maybe you're still figuring out how to be an ally. So if someone comes to you and says, my kid is trans or I'm trans, in an effort to be supportive, you can just say, I'm so glad you share that with me. That means you trust me. Let me connect you with David Fisher. He is such a great resource. I think he'll be able to really help you navigate this in a supportive way, right? So that's 3 sentences? It's really easy to just do that and be supportive, but if you're willing to share.
Sure. So I worked with, when I was still doing schools advocacy, I worked with a young person who was 14. He identified as a boy. He was born assigned female at birth. And he went to a new school. He was entering a school as a freshman. And he went to his counselor and he said, hey, I identify as a boy and I don't know what to do about that. My parents aren't supportive. But I don't think that I can go through the next 4 years by not having some sort of acknowledgement of my gender identity. So I just want to open up this conversation with you. And she said, great, I don't know what to do, but let me think about it. And she contacted his principal, who contacted his parents and outed him to his family. And the parents said, you absolutely may not identify as a boy. If you continue to identify as a boy in school, we will remove you from school. We will place you in a different school. You're not allowed to identify as a boy. He continued in different ways to identify as a boy. At one point, he asked to be called by a nickname. Another time, he had asked one of his teachers, who was also the social group that he was, the social club that he was a part of, was the advisor for that club, to say, like, in this space, could I just use he, his, him pronouns? And his principal found out and told his parents that he was doing that. And they wound up pulling him out of school and sending him to several boarding schools that were really, he got sent to an all-girls, Dr. Phil recommended boarding school that worked on his self-esteem and said that he identified as a boy because he had low self-esteem as a girl. And he unfortunately, through the course of many, many years, was shuffled in and out of these programs, and he ran away and he started using drugs. Unfortunately, he was 19, he didn't have a high school diploma, he had run away, gotten into a lot of drug use. His parents found him, brought him back to their house, again said you can't identify as a boy, and he suicided about 2 weeks after they found him. And this was 5 years of his life. So if anybody can remember back to what it meant to be a teenager and how long a year felt, think about 5 years of this, of what I can only imagine was really a really terrible experience in his life. And I think that all could have been stopped if we had all just if everyone in his life had just stopped for a minute and thought about how to better support him. So outing a kid can have the kinds of negative impacts that we may not even be able to anticipate. So.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's like the worst of all possible scenarios, but it can happen, right? So thinking through, like, you may think that a parent is supportive, you don't know. So just ask someone. It's their private information. Ask, who do you want to share this with? If anyone else. Are there, and what are they called? So David talked a lot about gender sort of being on a spectrum. So I think that idea is important to remember in this question. Because there's a lot of different ways that people will use to describe their gender identity. And because there's so many different types of people, there's so many different ways that people will describe their gender identity. So there is, of course, male and female, trans female, all the different ones that we've sort of shared so far. But there's many, many more ways that people will use to describe their gender identity. That's why those umbrella terms are really helpful. Non-binary, transgender, male, female, right? Those are helpful terms. But there's many more terms that are used to describe the different ways that people feel. But because there's so many different ways that people can identify, it's hard to quantify exactly how many genders there are because it's on a spectrum. So someone might exist here, and someone might exist right next to it right here. And someone might exist 2 inches over this way, right? So it's really hard to quantify.
And didn't you say at the first session that there were about 900?
At the first session we said there were about 900 different ways that in one survey, people used to describe their gender identity. Yes, exactly.
Yes. So in one survey, young people wrote in about 900 different unique responses. So,
right, so there's a huge variety of ways that people use to describe their gender, right? So there's tons of different terms. That's why those umbrella terms are really useful.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, too, it's not always important for us to navigate exactly where someone falls on our gender spectrum, but rather what they need to be supported.
Right.
And that's why it's important that when someone does share their gender identity, we don't necessarily need to plot it out on a graph, but we can say, thank you for sharing that with me. What can I do to support you?
Yeah. Do you want to do
Sure. So have you ever worked with a young person dealing with gender identity challenges whose parents were not supportive of their needs, but the parents changed their perspective and became more supportive of their child? And what do you believe led to their change, the change in parental attitude? I've worked with parents who have really seen their children in pain, and who haven't known how to support them or haven't been there with them, and realized that in order for their child to not be in pain, that they needed to figure out a way to support them. But Jen has actually worked with a lot more parents than I have. So
yeah. Yes, I definitely have. And I think just like every person is different, every parent is different. So everyone is navigating it in a different way. They are they're navigating in a different way. So yes, I have absolutely worked with parents who were unsupportive and over time maybe came to a point where maybe they weren't even 100% supportive, but they wanted their kid to be safe and they wanted their kid's mental health to be more stable, and this is what they sort of felt like they needed to do. I've had parents where one parent was supportive and one parent wasn't, and they were married. So there's a huge range of different ways that folks navigate this in their own families. I don't think that there's sort of one way that someone grows to become more supportive. I think I facilitate a parent support group, which is not a mental health group, it's just a social support group where folks can talk amongst themselves and sort of share their experiences. I think that has been a really useful tool for some parents who are navigating this for the first time, which guess what? Almost every parent is who's in that group. Everyone is navigating for the first time. And so it's a really helpful tool, I think, just to talk to and connect with other families and find out more what their experiences are and how they worked with in-laws and siblings and all of these different pieces that can be really challenging. And I think it's important to give parents the space to navigate their own challenges. Some parents feel, many parents have shared with me that, it feels like a death sometimes. You thought you had a daughter and you don't. You no longer have a daughter. That can be really hard. I think many of the parents that I work with who are supportive also then are blessed with a son, and have the opportunity to see their child be happy and healthy in a way that they never were when they were forced to be a gender that wasn't their identity. So yes, that I think, and so it's hard because there's no like one way to help someone get to a point where they're more comfortable or more supportive. But knowing that there's resources available and connecting people to those resources is, I would say, the number one thing that folks can do to be an ally to parents as well.
So we have another question that says, do you find that children are more accepting than adults of people going through questioning their identity? There's all sorts of developmental literature about when children are more accepting and why that is. But I actually think that I find that there's like a diversity of people that are accepting, and when we start to say like this group is accepting and this group isn't, we're really creating barriers, because I think that you will find people accepting throughout a whole diversity of experiences, and that's really important. That said, I think students are often really cool with trans students. In all of the work that I've done in schools, there's been a lot of anxiety about how other students are going to react, and it's wound up being really largely a non-issue.
Yeah, I totally agree with David. It's tricky to say like these people are and these people aren't. I will say by and large, anecdotally, most students are supportive of their peers. And I think typically what we've seen in research is that those who are not, it comes from other external factors, because younger kids really get it, actually. Younger kids are not conflating, what studies have sort of shown is that younger kids are not conflating sexual orientation and gender identity, which so many adults do. So it's hard for us sometimes as adults to wrap our minds around gender differences. But for younger kids, they really get it. So I had a kiddo come out in 3rd grade last year, and the questions that he got were, can we still hug? Are you going to change your last name? Will you go to the daddy-daughter dance still? So those are the kinds of questions. It's much more about like, okay, but like how is this impacting me? Versus adults are really having trouble kind of wrapping their minds around the differences of gender differences, oftentimes.
We also know that when students are in schools where adults are supportive, students are supportive. We know that often, and this actually says, are teenagers influenced by adults in their lives? Parents, for example. We know that how adults react to things changes how students react to things. One of my very good friends is a developmental psychologist who does research on school climate, and what she's found actually is that when teachers and school personnel favor certain young people, right? So there's that young person that's the jock, that's good in classes, and all of the teachers sort of really favor him. That stratification system actually then reaches down into the students. Students know who are favored by adults and who are who can be prey. And that young person who's favored can get away with a whole lot, and the young person who's not favored winds up getting in trouble a lot more and winds up being bullied and harassed a lot more. So we absolutely know that these structures affect how young people are treated, and that parents and peers and adults are so important in the lives of young people. We have this image of like teenagers being like footloose and fancy free, and they don't want any adults in their lives, but we actually know that young people really do want and need support and love and care from adults in their lives. So I think that that's a really important piece of who they are.
Yeah, so a lot of the sort of scary statistics that we showed around significant impacts that young people, trans young people, and gender diverse young people are facing in schools, and negative impacts. What we've seen is that schools that have GSAs, for example, schools that have supportive cultures, schools that have policies and procedures in place to help be inclusive and supportive, those statistics start to go down. So there's really clear correlation between schools that have like a Gay Straight Alliance or basically a club for LGBT kids have way less bullying that happens in the school. So that's a really clear example of the school setting a clear structure in place and having some systems in place to be supportive, and how that does impact students. So we want to talk really briefly about talking to children and young people about gender identity, because you're all parents. So this, I know there's a lot of text here, but basically let the young person or child guide the conversation. So what specifically are they trying to get out of the question that they're asking, right? Because sometimes we go like 15 steps ahead without really understanding what they're asking, especially in elementary and middle school, I would say. So for elementary school, keep it basic, right? You don't need to go into things like sex assigned at birth and what pronouns someone prefers, but you can use language that's developmentally appropriate to talk about gender. And in fact, there's actually some really great books for elementary age kiddos that talk about gender. Things like I Am Jazz, 10,000 Dresses, My Princess Boy, Be Who You Are. There's some really good resources to help you navigate that conversation. Middle school is similar, actually, but you can provide just a little more detail. So maybe that's where you start talking about things like sex assigned at birth versus gender identity. And then in high school, be clear in your explanation, but again, try to better understand what they're asking more specifically. I think especially in high school, that's important as well. Are there questions about gender? Is it related to them? Is it related to transition? Is it related to a friend? What are they asking? And this is all provided by a clinical social worker who specializes in gender identity, gave us some of this guidance. So yes, there's many books written specifically to guide and help these conversations to get things started. Books are a great jumping off point for any number of the things we've talked about, whether it's interrupting gender stereotypes, discussing gender differences, sexual orientation, etc. And the other piece of having these conversations is just discussing the importance of respect. So having an adult say, it's maybe not nice to ask that question, or it's not nice to call someone a name that someone doesn't feel good about. Those are important conversations to have, regardless of someone's gender identity. It's also important to say, it's okay to be curious. So I always tell teachers, we work in schools, we want kids to ask questions, right? That's okay. It's great to ask questions. It's not okay to ask really invasive questions. So that's an important distinction to make when talking to kids. Sometimes we hear things say, I don't want my child to think that being gay or trans is an okay option. And again, it's not really the school's job to dispute this, right? But information and discussion about trans people is not going to make anyone gay or trans. There's no research that has shown that happens. But knowing more about diverse people and diversity in general is more likely to make people kinder, is less likely to have a fear of something that someone doesn't understand and have bullying as a result of that. So we want to make sure that, knowing more information is making someone less likely to threaten or insult someone. And again, knowing someone who's gay or trans will not make you gay or trans. Sometimes we also hear questions around religious objections. And again, schools have tons of different people with tons of different beliefs. That's why public school is so great. And I should give David the opportunity to wax poetic about public school. But the one important thing I want to point out is, our job in schools is not to get everyone to agree. That's never really the goal. That shouldn't be the goal. But it's to make sure we're fostering an environment of respect and kindness, especially amongst the students and the community in the school. So respect is typically built by acknowledging the diversity within the school and within the school community. Tiny. People can read it? Okay, I'm going to give you a moment to read it. If you do have more questions, make sure you hold those up so that our wonderful Vanna Whites can grab those. And if you don't, because we've done such an amazing job of explaining things, and that's great too. So we're going to start to wrap up, so if you do have more questions, make sure you get those out. Otherwise, I wanted to share, again, we're not making this up as we go, so here's our sort of list of references where we pulled the research from, some of the content that was built this presentation. And then here's our contact info. So we're part of a network of professionals who support gender expansive young people, appropriately called the Gender Expansive Youth Network. We're very creative in the way we frame things. So David and I are both sort of founding members of the Gender Network, as well as Owen and Carolyn, who are hosting some of the other parent sessions. Contact us if you have questions, thoughts, concerns. Email is best. We are all off-site quite a bit doing things like this. So if you do have things that you, more information you're looking for, if you're looking for resources for folks, we have a ton. And there are, just to give you an example, we just have so many resources, all of the resources. So I can send this to you. And if folks have other questions, any other questions, hold it up. Otherwise, one more question. Well, as we wrap up, I want to ask folks to give a round of applause to the student volunteers. And they just got done doing Oklahoma, which I'm sure was amazing.
We have a spring play going on.
And you have a spring play going on? Do you want to pitch it really quick? What is it? What's the spring play?
It's called Done to Death.
What is it?
Done to Death.
Done to death.
Done to Death, premiering on what day?
Last weekend in April.
Yeah.
Last week in April.
All right, awesome.
So check it out. It'll be here in this very theater.
Okay, so we have two very related questions. One is, who assigns you your gender at birth? And what is the term for a person born with both sex organs? So, a doctor assigns sex at birth. No one assigns a gender at birth, because gender is your deeply held sense of who you are as a gendered person. As we talked about, intersex is an umbrella term for folks whose sex, whose characteristics of biological sex are incongruous with what we think of as typical male or typical female development. That said, I don't believe that there's anyone, I think how we sort of think about being born with both sex organs is sort of a misnomer.
Yeah, so it's truly like having both male and female external genitalia. It does happen actually. It's very, very rare. I think it's over 72 different types of disorders of sex development or differences of sex differentiation or intersex conditions. Those are all sort of the same word. Now you have heard them all. But there's tons of different variations, which is why we have those umbrella terms. So similar to there's a variation in gender identities, right? So we have the transgender umbrella term. There's a variation in sexes based on like internal and external genitalia, chromosomes, all kinds of things. So we do actually at Lurie Children's work with children who have DSDs and have some amazing specialists to help support families because as you can imagine, it's hard when a baby is born and a doctor says, I'm not sure. So that can be really challenging. But if it is a sort of a more stereotypically male or female genitalia, then a doctor is the one who says, it's a boy.
And there's actually a great documentary called Intersection, and it's spelled with S-E-X in the middle instead of S-E-C. So Intersection, which is made by an intersex documentary filmmaker who was seeking to sort of explain the trauma that they had experienced throughout their childhood, through having undergone numerous non-consensual medical procedures. And it's an amazing film that features a great many intersex activists from across the globe. So,
and there's some great books out there. There's one in particular that's very clear, that's pretty medical. So if you have questions about DSDs or intersex conditions, send me an email, send us an email.
yeah.
Any other questions?